Temperatures across the world are rising rapidly. Natural habitats are being destroyed by fire or floods, and carbon is still being pumped into the air. That means that in the next 10 years, the world has to find a way to reduce its emissions by 50%. This is where climate tech comes in. Climate tech refers to the technologies that are explicitly focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions or addressing the impacts of global warming in order to reach net zero by 2050. With 40% of the reduction of emissions relying on technology which hasn't yet reached the mass market, we need to scale these solutions, and we need to scale them rapidly. At TechNation, we're supporting the UK's most promising climate tech companies. We know that each successful net zero scale-up is another leap closer to decarbonising the world. We're working to make that happen. These companies are reimagining every aspect of our society and economy, from our transport, buildings and energy systems to the way we eat, shop and even handle our money. Agriculture and food waste is responsible for 15% of global emissions. In order to combat this, our net zero companies are accelerating sustainable agricultural practices, leveraging nature-based reducing food waste, and ensuring higher food stocks. Alongside agriculture, plastic pollution is another major emissions contributor and poses a huge threat to our marine environment and food chain. Our net zero innovators are developing alternatives to single-use plastics and are even transforming the way we wash our clothes. It is crucial to keeping our buildings running and our homes warm. However, the energy sector could be responsible for up to 30% of global emissions through burning fossil fuels. 18% of total energy also goes into buildings, and the built environment itself emits almost 40% of greenhouse gases. These companies are revolutionizing wind energy, disrupting solar energy, finding ways to optimize energy use, and decarbonizing buildings and cities. From activities inside the home to the way we travel, these net zero companies are leaving no stone unturned. The transport sector currently emits around 14% of global emissions. These companies are facilitating the adoption of electric vehicles, reducing traffic pollution, accelerating the transition to sustainable supply chains, and revolutionizing freight delivery systems to decarbonize our economy. With over 35 billion tonnes of CO2 emitted each year, it is imperative to offset the carbon we release. While strategies to reduce emissions are critically important, they will not be enough to reach net zero on their own. Reaching net zero requires strategies that actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Companies are accelerating this effort through creating direct air capture devices, using satellite data to verify the offsetting industry, and through giving companies vetted carbon removal projects to choose from. You can't manage what you don't measure. Calculating your individual or company's carbon footprint is a necessary step to understanding your contribution to global warming, so you can identify ways to reduce it. Our companies are enabling consumers to track the environmental impact of their spending through the UK's first green debit card and enabling businesses to understand and reduce their carbon footprint. It is clear that climate tech plays a fundamental part in achieving net zero, and the companies part of the net zero programme play a key role. While climate tech is growing, it is far from the scale society needs to make the overarching goal of net zero before 2050 a reality. In this climate decade, it is vital we put all our efforts into scaling this sector to safeguard the future of our planet. Temperatures across the world
Hello. That's a lot better. Should have probably done that from the start. But here we are. But yeah, without further ado, facing with their growth. So George, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Right in time for the mic to work. So I'm going to set the context, really, and quite briefly just talk you through some of the key findings from the report before we really hear from, I guess, you guys here on what it's really like and some of the challenges that you're facing and some of the, I guess, great solutions that you're pioneering. But the message from the research was really quite clear, and that is that the UK is a really high performer, but there is a lot more that needs to be done to support scale-ups to accelerate their growth, and change will simply come too slowly if we don't see increased levels of investment, particularly among the venture capital community. We explore companies that are creating or applying technologies that are explicitly focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions or addressing the impacts of global warming. So we were focused on those core companies that are really pioneering in the UK, and comparing those companies to their counterparts and colleagues and collaborators right across the world to get a sense of how the UK is really faring. And in doing that, we wanted to really shed light on the companies at the forefront of tech innovation. We know that the UK has a fundamental part to play in combating climate change, but how scale-ups are assisted to do that is something that I guess is still quite up in the air, and there are a lot of gaps that exist currently. Scaling challenges for many of the companies that we talk to are acute, and many of them are quite well compounded for net zero companies, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The UK government's put in place its 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which does promise more investment into the UK. How that investment is made is as important as the investment that's being put into it in terms of volume. So taking a worldwide view, the report dives into some of the top net zero nations globally and really looking at what global effort will be required in order to help hit the target that was mentioned in the video. So I'm going to run through quite a few stats quite quickly. If you do miss anything, do take a look at the net zero report, which is on technation.io/net zero report 2021. Just to give you an initial, there are nearly 5,000 net zero scale-ups globally, just under 3,000 in Europe, and just over 550 in the United Kingdom. So that's 20% of European ecosystem, 12% of the global ecosystem. And when you compare that to other metrics in terms of how the UK is punching economically, that is over-indexing on the number of companies. But it's also over-indexing on the amount of investment that's being raised. So we've seen that UK net zero firms have raised just over 1.57 billion to date in 2021. And that puts the UK second just to Sweden in Europe, and it puts the UK fourth behind the US, China and Sweden in the world. And over the last few weeks, this has been something that we've been sort of paying attention to, and we wanted to leave it to the very last minute to publish the report so that we could capture this data. We've seen a bit of what we're calling a COP pop in terms of VC investment. Over $60 million invested over the last couple of weeks into net zero companies. And it's likely that that investment has been announced over the last couple of weeks in order to piggyback on some of the sort of PR and I guess just general conversation around COP. But it is also indicative of the, I guess, increased investment that we're seeing and that trend towards investing in net zero tech companies, in essence. We can see that London's really dominating the net zero landscape, accounting for 72% of investment and 46% of companies by numbers. So we can see that London is punching above its weight in terms of the amount of investment raised, and it is quite a concentrated cluster for companies based there. And then thinking about those companies that are operating at scale, so those companies that are valued between $250 and $850 million, and those unicorn tech companies, the fabled unicorns, which are still fairly fabled when it comes to net zero. There are far fewer of them than we see in the ecosystem as a whole. We can see that 11 out of the 234 global net zero futurecorns, as we call them, those companies valued between 250 and 850, are in the UK. That's about 5% of the global population, and just under 8% of billion-dollar value net zero tech companies are based in the UK out of that global unicorn population. So not only are net zero companies developing pioneering new technologies and solutions, but in doing so they're elevating the UK as a net zero hub, and they're also creating an ever-growing number of jobs here. It was up 33% between 2020 and 2021 to just over 23,000 people employed in net zero scale-ups in the UK. When you put that into context and think about the digital tech economy as a whole and think about the digital tech labour market, there are just under 3 million people working in digital tech roles across that broad labour market. So based on that, there's still relatively few people working in these core net zero companies. When we take fintech, for example, we're looking at just over 100,000 people working in fintech. So it doesn't compare too badly, given that this is a much more nascent area of activity in the tech ecosystem. And really, to top off this reel of stats about the UK, we can see that net zero tech companies have nearly doubled their value over the course of the last year. And that's important. Not only are these companies generating investment, which obviously contributes to their value, but their value is increasing from about $25 billion to just under $50 billion in the space of a year, which is astronomical. Now, getting down to company level, and I realise I'm rapidly reeling through this, so bear with me. But we found that 61% of companies have at least one technical founder, a founder with technical, chemistry, biology, and earth science backgrounds, and that is way over-indexed, as you might expect, for the broader tech population. 26% of net zero tech companies have at least one female founder, and 17% were started by a serial founder. That is all significantly higher than the tech population, or the tech scale-up population as a whole. And that has its advantages, but it also, in some cases, may well have, I guess, some problematic aspects to it based on the system that these companies are operating in. Of the 137 companies that applied to Net Zero 2.0, 46% identified talent or hiring as one of their top 3 scaling challenges. That's not really surprising. And 22% explained to us that funding was one of their biggest obstacles to growth. And in many ways, I thought that might be higher, because looking at the funding ratio and looking at the stages of company growth between net zero companies and tech companies as a whole, we can see that net zero companies essentially have a much lower chance of moving through from seed and early growth to late growth based on the funding that they receive. So 5 net zero companies will start at seed stage or early stage, and one of them will achieve late stage funding, compared to 5 scale-ups in the tech ecosystem as a whole, and 3 of them achieving late stage funding. That doesn't mean that they're going to go on to be the highest performing tech companies in the UK, but it does mean that they're getting the funding. So not achieving this later stage investment can often be pretty fatal, if not damaging at least, for net zero companies because of the longer time to market and expensive staffing and recruitment costs. And I'm sort of teaching you to suck eggs here, you know this. As a founder from an underrepresented background in net zero, the challenge of raising finance can be compounded in many ways. It's harder to raise money as a net zero company based on, as we said, sort of longer lead time. We need more patience, but equally it's harder to raise funding as an underrepresented founder. And given that we've seen just over 25% of net zero companies having at least one female founder, that could be a problem that is exacerbated in the net zero ecosystem. In the report, we were really lucky to have some amazing comments from companies like yourselves, as well as others like Tessa Clark from Olio, and I think she summarises things really well. She said that climate tech investment is simply not growing quickly enough. At the last count, it was just 6% of all VC investment. And she puts the emphasis on venture capital firms. She says, like every industry, the VC industry is going to need to stand up and be counted through the climate crisis and rapidly figure out what their all-hands-on-deck response is, because business as usual certainly isn't going to cut it. So we need to think aspirationally. As Tessa said, the way we're thinking and acting on the climate crisis currently isn't going to cut it, certainly with regard to supporting net zero scale-ups and supporting these companies to deliver for a greener world. We feel that we need to see at least a 10x increase in venture capital investment into UK net zero firms, And we feel that one of the ways in which that's going to be done is by de-risking some of that investment for VCs who perhaps don't have the appetite to invest in companies in the net zero space at the moment. So we need government, we need public bodies, and we need large corporations to help potentially de-risk this investment for really quite, in many ways conservative, but in other ways very risk-hungry VC firms. So, in essence, to alleviate the crisis, we need a joined-up effort. We need corporates, public bodies, VCs, government to work together. We need a global effort, and we need rapid change. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. I've gone over slightly, so thank you for bearing with me. And I'm going to hand over to a stellar panel, of which I realise I'm today part of. So, so yeah, I should scrap that bit. But thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, George. Some fascinating insights there. And that really is a very nice segue into our panel, because, of course, climate startups and scale-ups can really support multinationals in decarbonising, and that's what this panel is all about. So I'd like to introduce Sarisher Mann, who's the Sustainable Finance Communications and Engagement Manager at BNP Paribas, who will be moderating this panel, along with Andrew Woods, co-founder and CEO of Catagen, who are on the Net Zero 2.0 cohort, as well as Genevieve Patenaude, who's the co-founder and CEO of Earthblox, and Hervé Duteil, if I'm pronouncing that okay, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer of BNP Paribas. So welcome.
George, you can come on the end as well. Oh, I think we'll just pull this across. There we go. Thank you so much. And Sammy and George, congratulations on the report as well. And to Tech Nation, I think it's been a really great collaboration over the last few years. Just for context of BNP Paribas' involvement with Tech Nation. So the bank has a really strong strategy in terms of supporting net zero, and particularly in the UK, it's quite a diverse setup. There's 9 business lines, and actually the transition of the real economy, I think, requires a real collaboration with actors that are completely outside of the finance industry. And so that's where our partnership with Tech Nation began, in terms of wanting to support some of the founders and some of the real innovators that are at the forefront of the transition technologies, which many of our clients are trying to actually implement. And so that's the kind of context of BNP Paribas' involvement. In terms of this particular net zero report, I think what's interesting is the evolution of that from the report that was done last year as well. I think there's been a real notable mobilization of the sectors that you all operate in. I think even being here at COP, I think, has been a fascinating experience to see how you've got this very symbiotic relationship between the policymakers, the innovators, the corporates that are really incumbents in many of these markets, and also finance. And I think compared to many COPs we've seen previously, I was at COP21 with BNP Paribas in Paris back in 2015, and I think there's been a huge shift of many of those stakeholders coming together and starting to talk in a similar way about what's required. But I think many of them still acknowledge the huge solutions gap that they and their organizations have. And I think it's fantastic that we've got the panel here today, because in particular, Genevieve and Andrew are really, yourselves and the rest of the startups in the room, at the forefront of those solutions. So in terms of handing over to both of you first, we'd love to hear a bit more about the solutions you're working on at Catagen and on Earthblox. Did a bit of research in terms of the application of those solutions as well. So in the panel, we're going to cover both the technologies you're implementing and how we can scale those up in a broader ecosystem, both within finance that we work with, but also with companies that might be in adjacent sectors, and how that technology that you're creating applies. So Andrew, over to you first, and we'd love to hear more about what Catagen's doing in the automotive mobility space.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Thanks very much to BNP Paribas for inviting me along, and great to be a part of this panel. So just a bit of background about Catagen. Catagen started out in this space about 10 years ago when I started my PhD in mechanical engineering, and we were studying the effect of emissions in after-treatment systems and in the tailpipe of a vehicle. at Queen's University, and we realised back then that the tool set to really understand emissions didn't exist. So we ended up creating the tool set and patenting the concept of a recirculating gas reactor. We successfully spun that business out of the university, and there's two major advantages of that approach to the automotive industry. The first major advantage was the quality of the test data that came off the test reactors that we had built, and that allowed the vehicle developers to develop and calibrate the ECU to reduce the tailpipe emissions. The second major advantage was that it was extremely energy efficient. It was about 80% more energy efficient than the engine, and we supplied the supplementary power via renewable energy. So we had taken a dirty process that's required by legislation and turned that into an entirely clean process, and have successfully built a test facility in Belfast where we service the world's most amazing brands, high performance luxury car manufacturers and motorcycle manufacturers under NDA, so I can't describe the brands, but if you ream off the top 5 or 6, we're probably working with 70 or 80% of them. And so we've built up a sort of a core customer base of around 20 different market segments. We're working with we're working with the legislative bodies to help make sure that future roads will be cleaner, and we're bringing out new techniques to support the EU Commission, for example, on how that's done. But really, what's really exciting about what's going on right now is the opportunity that has came about, and we noticed that we realised a long time ago that the future emissions was going to be a major problem. And it kind of took a while for the market to catch up. But whenever we sort of look at the core competencies within the Catagen business, we are experts in emissions. And we have about 6 terabytes of really high quality emissions data. And we have also got our own simulation tools. So how can we apply that capability to new markets and help deliver on our purpose, our core purpose, to clean and decarbonise the air of the future? So we're releasing our first product, which is a personalised emissions data platform that can translate a person's behaviour into tangible emissions quantifications. And the real focus of that product is that software platform is to help people make more informed decisions. Typically speaking, there's about 180 million individual car journeys taken across the UK every year. And if we can reduce that by 20% and encourage people to work from home, or to encourage people to take the bus or take the car 1 day a week, that there results in about 14.5 million tonnes of CO2 that doesn't go into the atmosphere as a result. So we're currently developing that platform, and we're working with Belfast City Council in seeing if we can roll that out. But we've identified that as a means to get the collective population of a city working together to reduce pollution. The other sort of core expertise that we have within our business is we are masters of the recirculating gas reactor, and I can say that with my hand on my heart because I've been through so much development of that piece of kit. It's pushed me right to the edge many times, but we know that inside out, and it's a really energy efficient reactor, which means there are other applications. So two other products that we're working on is the development of a green hydrogen generator, where we power the reactor with renewable energy and feed it with water to create green hydrogen. And there's some advantages over conventional approaches with our approach, that I'll not really go into here. And then the other innovation that we're working on is e-fuel production reactions within our reactor system, and that's to combine CO2 taken from the atmosphere with green hydrogen to create a long chain hydrocarbon that could be used for jet fuel or e-diesel, or but a totally renewable fuel that will help I guess, decarbonise the more difficult parts of industry that need to decarbonise, such as marine and aviation. So that's really where we are. Sorry about the long-winded approach, but
it's really interesting. And I think in you said many many interesting things there, but the two kind of key takeaways I'd see of interest in terms of some of the corporates we work with and the application, and we'll delve into this a bit later in the panel, is the cities. The way you work with cities is really interesting. Today at COP it's Transport Day, and a lot of the discussions I've heard across in the blue zone, which is where some of the kind of government delegations are going on, are actually these questions on adaptation. And so much of the investment that we see at the moment in terms of sustainable finance actually goes into mitigation, where I think 7% or less goes into adaptation finance right now. So the work that you're doing there on trying to retrofit cities and look at how people move around the city to then reduce the emissions, I think is a really interesting way to approach that. And we've heard a lot over there about different types of mobility. I think the hydrogen point you mentioned is something we'll delve into a bit later on the application of that across sectors. I think we've saw a hydrogen bus outside the other day, and also on the some of the heavy carbon intensive industries like steel. I think that work you're doing there on the energy transition of hydrogen is really vital to leapfrog actually from potentially grey hydrogen straight to green if you've got the right chemical process in place to do that and the right context in which you're working. So we'd love to hear more about that in a moment. And over to Genevieve. I think it's we are really interested to hear more about your work on the ESG data side. I know Andrew said that's something that they're looking at quite extensively for the mobility sector, but how do you use your solution in terms of understanding the role of ESG data? You do a lot of work on forestry and other agricultural areas, so it'd be great to hear a bit more about that.
First, I'd like to thank the panel and BNP Paribas as well as TechNation for inviting us. Before I describe a bit more Earthblox and the way that we contribute to supporting companies with their ESG goals, I thought I'd give a little bit of a background, because the company is difficult to dissociate the company from your own history and your own past and how you came to leading a company like Earthblox. So I did my PhD in Oxford, and then I got a position here at the University of Edinburgh as assistant professor. I contributed to the IPCC. I've got a wealth of knowledge on climate change, but also over the past 30 years, I've been using satellites continuously to map and monitor the change that we're observing on the planet and the dramatic effect that humans have on our ecosystems. And it's become increasingly clear to me that as we're trying to scale, climate innovation and really address climate mitigation and adaptation at scale, we need to provide climate intelligence and climate solutions that are accessible at scale. And that's where Earthblox was born. Because satellite imagery, there are 650 satellites right now, Earth observation satellites, that are collecting data and monitoring the planet. But how do you access this? Just show me a show of hands. Who in this room has used satellite imagery or uses satellite imagery regularly? Pretty much nobody. But what if you could? What if you could look anywhere in the world, anytime, at forests that perhaps you own, your supply chain, the risks that are present either historically or in near real time? That could completely transform the way that we interact and we conduct business. So Earthblox is basically a no-code, it's a SaaS, it's a no-code solution for planetary data solution building. It works a bit like Lego. So you connect blocks, you create your solution, and you have a full dashboard that then shows the information that you need. So the type of customers that we work with are quite varied. All of them have similar needs for intelligence across the globe in difficult areas, because they're global entities. So one example is the United Nations. So we work with the United Nations Environment Program, and there we support 130 teams that actually try to support vulnerable communities. So Earthblox And then it brings in as well all sorts of socio-economic data that gives us an indication of where are those communities that are most at risk from those compounded factors. So that's the kind of work that we do, is providing intelligence. Because without intelligence, you can't make choices, and you can't make the right choices for sustainability.
So I think I'm going to hand over to Hervé in a moment, because I think the work that you're doing, sorry, phone keeps falling, the work that you're doing in this space is really vital in terms of the materiality of some of those issues, especially on looking at forest degradation, looking at carbon emissions. I think that in order for finance and for many corporates that are kind of larger scale to really manage those, they say ESG, but it's becoming really climate, physical risk from climate, biodiversity risk, nature-related risk. We have to have that data, and I think the knowledge that then transpires from the work that you're doing at Earthblox is really essential, because it means that we can integrate it in a very material way to ensure that when we create innovation, whether it's supply chain innovation that companies are doing to reduce their emissions, or whether it's financial products like sustainability-linked bonds or loans, that the right data is actually the basis of that decision making. I'm going to introduce Hervé as well now, because I think Hervé has a wealth of knowledge in this space, both on some of that innovation we've seen in the industry. Hervé's been at the forefront of that in the Americas, both in an emerging markets context of LATAM and also with North America as well. So Hervé, how do you see the role of finance in particular embracing some of these technologies that have been discussed today, and also more broadly, what is the role of banks like BNP Paribas and the broader industry to support the clean tech pioneers that are in this room, and also hopefully listening in on YouTube as well?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So first I'm going to start with the second question, because I want to follow up on what you were saying, and it's absolutely fascinating, actually, what you were describing. So I represent finance, and finance can be very boring, but hopefully I'm going to make it a bit exciting for you tonight. So the first 2 points I'd like to make. The first one is, today everyone talks about sustainability, maybe too much. But you can go from CNBC to Fox News to any CEO of any major corporation to all banks. Everyone talks about sustainability. When we were before COP21, that was absolutely not the case. At COP15 really showed up people like you and me who were plugged maybe on the topic. But it's after COP15 actually that it became really pervasive. And I truly believe that the culprit for this, if it's a gold culprit, is actually finance. I think before it was really niche. Something happened in finance. Up to then, it was in the space of investing that you had sustainable investing. And in fact, sustainable investing, you could date back to the 19th century in the Quakers, or the 70s, or the 80s with some funds starting to exclude some stocks that were related to apartheid in South Africa. And then there was a renewal about 20 years ago with so-called SRI, Sustainable Responsible Investing. But all of that up to 2015 remained niche. It was about creating a fund, putting a thematics, whether you want it to be water or low carbon, putting a few stocks in it, and you were done. But that was really a specialty type of finance. And even the UN didn't make sustainability universal. They started in the 2000s with the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And again, by the time of COP21, no one really was talking about sustainability. So what happened? And I think what happened was finance managed to create a new mousetrap, which is a race to the top. So instead of focusing on the investing side, which is, investors and what they put in portfolios, we focused on the issuer side or the borrower side, one client at a time, one transaction at a time. And sustainable finance made two discoveries. The first discovery was the moment you start labeling a bond, you start to attract a new class of investors who care. So the green bond funds, the sustainability funds. So you've heard about green bonds, but labels are very numerous. We have social bonds, gender bonds, blue bonds, rhino bonds, COVID-19 response bonds, forest bonds, gender bonds, and so on and so forth. So that was the very first discovery that attracted awareness. And what happens is human psychology goes in. The moment someone in the auto sector does a green bond, then all their competitors or peers want to do better. And so that's what we achieved. Those financing mechanisms, per my judgment, and don't quote me on this, really has zero impact. But the major impact it had was to bring us where we are today, where there is this virtuous competition that is dragging slowly but surely the entire private sector to do better, to be more transparent. The second discovery, much more interesting, was a few years later, was that we could also tie the interest rate to future sustainability performance. So instead of looking at what the use of funds is for, a green bond, it's to build wind farms, a gender bonds, it's to promote women in management, etc. Instead of looking at how the money is being used, we looked at the impact, and the interest rate moves a little bit up or a little bit down in relation to your performance vis-a-vis some targets. If you think about it, it's a revolution in the space of finance. For thousands of years, we've lent money at a price that reflects your ability to repay the lender. But all of a sudden, we index it also a little bit to the ability to do good. And that's what sustainability-linked loans or sustainability-linked bonds that Sarisher referred to are about. So finance was about creating a race to the top. The major impact has been bringing the conversation. The second point I would like to make before moving back to your first question is, and linking to data, every crisis leads us to a new leap forward in transparency. If you think of the 1929 crisis, that brought transparency about companies' profitability. And there's always also an enabling technology. And at the time, if we can call it a technology, it was the emerging auditing business. So after the 1929 crisis, you know, the accounting standards were created, and that's when we started to publish transparent financial information. The 2008 subprime crisis brought transparency around banks' leverage. We saw what happened to Lehman. When banks are over-leveraged, then they can collapse and create systemic crisis. And the enabling technology to bring transparency on banks' leverage and resiliency or fragility was what we call stress testing, or Monte Carlo simulations, if you wish. So stress testing a bank's balance sheet upon thousands of scenarios. The COVID-19 pandemic crisis, first of all, it was the first sustainability crisis of this century. But it brought the need for transparency on social and environmental impact. And there is a technology we didn't have 15 years ago, and that's exactly what you were describing. It's the availability of data and the ability to process data. Maybe we had data 15 years ago, but with AI, with big data, and many other things that are way beyond me, we have the ability to gather satellite imagery for methane emissions, deforestation impact by large agricultural companies, and so on. And we can bring this back into financial products. We can all of a sudden tie pricing, cost of risk to existing data. So now to wrap up on the role of finance, because we have this data, it has been the driver of this sustainable finance revolution. Now, when it comes to clean techs, the banking sector, we cater, frankly, we don't cater clean techs for the most part. We cater big corporations, the Fortune 500 corporations. In this net zero transition, there are three things we can do. First, we can accompany their decarbonization journey, and that's where the sustainability-linked products can intervene. We tie CO2 emissions basically to an interest rate. But beyond decarbonization or efficiency, water efficiency, whatever you want, many sectors, especially 10 hard-to-abate carbon-intensive sectors, not only needs to improve efficiency, decarbonize, but they very often have to change business models. You're an oil and gas company, you have to become an energy company. You're a tech company, you may have huge opportunities in the smart mobility, autonomous vehicle space, and so on and so forth. And for that, we need clean techs, because those disruptions, big corporations, to fast forward this innovation, needs to get closer to clean tech. Some of them will be the successful ones. And you see a lot of money flowing into that space for that very reason. Yes, you have VC capital. Yes, you have private equity. But you also have large corporations like Amazon, like Microsoft, Volkswagen is rumored to be, Toyota. All of these have set up clean tech funds, climate innovation funds, precisely to get closer to what are going to be the big winners of tomorrow's economy. And I'll conclude with this, even banks are doing the same. Just to give an example, BNP Paribas, we created a fund with our longtime partner, the Solar Impulse Foundation, which is led by Bertrand Piccard, the guy who flew around the world with this electric-powered plane. And so the Solar Impulse Foundation made a call for the 1,000 startups that are not only successful prototypes, but also economically feasible. And so we launched the BNP Paribas Solar Impulse Fund. BNP put 150 million euros in that fund of its own capital, and it's calling for other investors to sideline with us to precisely get closer to this ecosystem, in relation, of course, with our big clients. We don't invest only solely for the winners, but we want to be in the winners that really matter also for our clients to accelerate their journey.
Thank you, Hervé. There's a wealth of information there in terms of the application of our industry in particular. And I think I want to hand over to George in terms of the question around what are some of those challenges that scale-ups are talking to you about in terms of connecting with corporates. I think one of the main reasons the bank got involved in TechNation program was to try and play that bridging role across an ecosystem that we support, but that desperately needs help to collaborate with startup providers and solutions providers like yourselves that actually understand those issues and are investing in that. So is that something that the cohort, both from the previous year and this year, have said is one of the key objectives of the program? How do you see that in terms of the support that corporates can provide, and also the investment community to connect across the different sectors that are present in the cohort?
So with this one, I might even hand over to Sammy in a second, but I think from my perspective, I range of different challenges that are faced in terms of curating that relationship between any small company and a large corporation, but particularly in the net zero space, I guess many logistical considerations, and really it's about finding that sort of the right port in which a company can dock into a large corporation. But in some cases, it is some of the very soft and quite intangible aspects of company culture, and simply the sort of roles that exist within scaling tech companies and how they match up with some of the different reporting lines and departments and so forth within larger corporations. I mean, when we look at the data from the applications from companies that applied to the most recent net zero program, we can see it was quite clear that many of the challenges these companies are experiencing really mirror those that are being experienced by companies that are scaling in UK tech more broadly. It is about hiring. It is about access to finance. It is in many ways about collaboration and having access to collaborators, customers, suppliers. But I think that there probably are some very nuanced points that Sammy can talk to with regard to net zero companies and corporations.
I can come in very briefly. I mean, I think one of the key focuses we have on the program is to make corporates aware of how they can decarbonize. Whether it's a automotive company, whether it's a company who needs to utilize satellite imagery to monitor environments around the world, whether it's a company who is requiring, for example, solar panels which don't fit onto kind of existing roof to decarbonize, to actually have a really robust net zero strategy. And at the same time, I think we've suddenly seen a lot more interest, especially in the last 6 months, from corporates engaging with the startups in our program. And of course, it's been great to see the growth of, for example, Catagen and Earthblox, and many of the companies in this room as well. I think it's safe to say traction is suddenly building. COP26 has, of course, helped with that. In the last 6 months, we've been riding a wave, I think, of interest, especially in climate tech, which is great. But of course, more needs to be done. It's the first time corporates are really looking into decarbonising. So from their perspective, of course, it's a risk. Many of the technologies we need to achieve net zero are yet to achieve economies of scale. So from a cost perspective as well, corporates are having to dig out much larger pools of money than they ever have before to decarbonise. So there's a plethora of challenges, but at the same time, momentum is looking promising. And I think, of course, policy can play its part, policy regulation, incentives. The breakthrough agenda that's been announced is still slightly unclear in terms of what that looks like, but that's certainly promising. Great to hear that over 50 nations have signed up to make clean tech in general more affordable, more accessible. So hopefully that continues. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to take it back to Andrew in terms of the tangible roadmap for that collaboration. So, for example, in hydrogen, the bank's been doing quite a lot of work in terms of across different segments of clients. So not just the mobility sector, but also with large utility companies, autos, even the heavy industrials such as steel. Because we essentially, as a large bank, we have those companies as portfolio companies, and also from the capital markets innovations that Hervé mentioned, trying to support them access to investment in this space. But one thing that's really interesting is to understand from your perspective as someone at the forefront of that technology, particularly green hydrogen, where are some of those collaboration roadmaps going? Is it the case that you're kind of plugging in and doing an advisory role with those corporates? Is it that you're kind of doing open source sharing? Do you plug into their infrastructure? How do you see that roadmap with some of the sectors that you work with, particularly on hydrogen?
Really good question. It's interesting to hear the feedback. I think what's important here too, before I answer your question, is we are in a climate emergency, and I think everybody has to change how they're working. The finance industry has to reimagine things. I noticed an interesting CNBC report recently where the next 1,000 unicorns were going to be in the next going to be in the net zero sector. So there's going to be lots of big winners here, but that alone should also sort of encourage the investment community to take more risks. And the role I see for corporates, in our core business, we work with corporates, and as a scaling SME, it's difficult to penetrate a large corporate and get in and speak to the right person. I think there needs to be more corporate responsibility where they perhaps are ring fencing the sums of money to sort out their decarbonisation issues, but also perhaps set it up in a way that is more like an SBRI, where they run challenges for net zero SMEs to come in and sort out their problems. The key thing here is customers. Customers equals secure revenue, which equals jobs, which means you can build layers upon layers of capability within the scaling SME. And then that then justifies the investment, because that's what the finance industry want to see. They want to see revenue, they want to see a customer base. So it's a win-win-win. So I think, how do we all work together to make that win-win-win? Now, to answer your question about hydrogen, it's still in its infancy about how best to partner, and I think partnerships is going to play a big part here. Technology companies such as ourselves, I think we could see, I suppose, the way to rapidly scale and roll out technology would be to partner and identify the right corporates to work with that have the capabilities and the know-how to complement companies such as ourselves. Is that fair enough?
That's a really good point on the partnerships, and I think it kind of links nicely to Genevieve's technology, because I think one thing we've seen out of COP, and particularly from corporates, is commitments on transition towards net zero from all three scopes of their emissions, actually 1, 2, and 3. And I think the interesting materiality point is how do you ensure that from the collaboration perspective that actually the data that they're using to create those models and the point you made about the profitability and viability of the business model is very interesting. I think a lot of the companies that we work with, especially in terms of the time horizon of those transition targets, because they do have 2050 targets, there's an interesting question around the time scale of their commitment to that investment. And I think it's really interesting with these targets that some of the clean tech solutions are likely going to be useful for their 30 to 50 trajectory, because currently they might only be addressing scope 1 and 2, and then scope 3, for example, with oil companies is something that is material to their business, but that they address post 2030. I think, Genevieve, I wanted to ask you a question around the communities, because in the data that you look at as Earthblox, I think some of the agriculture and forestry data is really interesting, and understanding how companies that look at nature-based solutions, and even finance that's rapidly trying to upskill itself to understand the role of finance in creating nature-based solutions, creating adaptation finance. Even today I was in the plenary session with Alok Sharma, and he was talking about that today at COP they're going to be looking at finalizing an agreement on adaptation finance and ensuring that the communities that are most affected by climate and biodiversity loss are actually accounted for in terms of the investment that companies and financial system is making. So how do you see the role of what Earthblox is doing there to bring in that community knowledge into the platform you're creating to bridge some of those dialogues? Because one thing we always hear on nature is, oh, the lack of data, it's really hard to get material data, it's all qualitative. And I think what you're creating at Earthblox kind of counters that narrative really strongly and develops a very scientific solution to something that people see as a social problem.
That's a very good question. I think the key thing is that adaptation is the elephant in the room, right? And it's mitigation is obviously an imperative. It's not even, a market opportunity or however people can portray this. But adaptation is, because we're already in the realm of climate change, right? So mitigation we have to do, and that's just it. But the reality of adaptation is the complexity of what's involved because of the difference in circumstances everywhere around the world. So how do we support adaptation? So Earthblox per se does not create solutions. So Earthblox is a solutions builder. So what we do is we empower those that have the domain knowledge, those that actually are able to best support adaptation action, adaptation strategies, to create their insights, the insights that they need to inform their decision making, because in the reality of a resource limited world, choices have to be made in how you best adapt, how you best support. So Earthblox is supporting, I mentioned earlier on, UNEP. We work with insurance companies. I mean, it's less adaptation, but there's a form of adaptation in insurance, right? So something burns in fire, you have an insurance product that can help you then rebuild. So it's a kind of adaptation. So yeah, it's through that intelligence and bring in not just satellite imagery, but now today we've got access to all sorts of information of how communities are built, of how the vocabulary that's being used through text, so you can feel the pulse of a society and how at risk it may be of conflicts, or at risk it may be of being extremely stressed. So the challenge here is how do we integrate all of this to inform supporting those communities. So yeah, that's how I would answer this.
I think that's really interesting because it's about plugging in the intel that you have into a system where people might not understand how to translate that, and giving them this kind of translation tool of what's happening on the ground, I think is really vital. Hervé, from your perspective, how do you see some of those developments of the ESG metrics? I know from BNP Paribas side, we've done a lot of work over the last year or so on open source technology. So we partnered with a company called OS Climate, and we actually had an event over here, not in the Arctic Basecamp tent itself, but just in the igloo next door, that was specifically on the role of open source data, because for a financial institution, I think understanding the climate risk across the 6 highest carbon emitting sectors and ensuring that as an industry we move is really vital. So Hervé, how do you see that on ESG metrics, and then that broader industry approach? Do you think that's where finance is going, these kinds of sector coalitions, or even coalitions where we've got startups involved? TechNation's a fantastic example of that here in the UK, but is that reflected in the work you're seeing in the Americas? How do you see the evolution of that on metrics and coalition?
Yes, I think that's exactly the disruption that we, the finance industry, or even the banking industry, are facing. I mean, you spoke about the disruptions that traditional industrial sectors have to go through. If you're an auto company, an airline, a cement company, a steel company, and so on, it's pretty clear, that, or even real estate or agriculture, all those companies, as I said, have to embrace new business models, which are quite far sometimes from their originally core model. We remain a financier, but actually we too are actually disrupted by this change, and in 2 ways. One, before I get to data, the first one is we too have to be part of those collaboration coalitions. The only problem is we don't have the resources, we don't have the time, we don't have enough people. We're a fairly capital-intensive industry, surprisingly. And the universe, and on top of it, we're one step remote from the real economy. So it's even harder for us to figure out who are going to be the winners. We can't. We have a limited set of beans to put on the game board, and we're not. And on top of it, it's multi-sector. Unlike a power utility that can solely focus on clean techs related to the energy sector, we have to cover all the sectors, and at the same time, there's not one single sector. We're frontline in terms of expertise, and thirdly, again, banks are traditionally catering medium to large size companies. We're not venture capitalists, so. At the same time, we have to advise our medium-sized and large-sized clients in terms of what they should divest, what they should acquire, or what joint ventures they should go, and how we can capitalize that. So we need to have those feet in the game, but it's not our core business, if I must say, but it's a prerequisite to give the best financial advice, once again, in terms of acquisitions, divestments, and collaborations that are going to be fruitful, and which we will eventually finance. So that's the first disruptions. The other is indeed data. We need a whole set of data, and we need to aggregate this data, and we need to also have harmonized, standardized data, so we can compare companies in energy in Asia Pacific and transport companies in Americas, let's say. And again, it's a huge challenge. First of all, because data is coming from all sorts. One question I wanted to ask you is how many satellite imagery companies they are, because I know some in the US, and I'd be curious to know how many, how you see that landscape. But just to give a feel of data is coming from all places. There are over 100 data frameworks to report water, to report carbon, etc. Which one do you choose? And as we aggregate all that data, it has to go in our systems. We currently have a lot of dozens of people in IT and reporting, creating new fields. We need to tag every transactions. We need to add new fields to our client database in terms of net zero commitment. Is it validated, committed by SBTi? Does it include scope 3? Does it include equity, minority equity interest in, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a huge challenge on those two fronts. Collaborations, we have to pick and choose the right ones because we can't be everywhere, but it's a necessity to advise clients. And data, especially as you're a large bank, you can imagine we have tens of systems which already have a hard time speaking to each other, and we have all this wealth of data points to integrate.
Thank you so much. And I think on that point around, I'm conscious of the time and we do want to move to Q&A in the audience as well. But in terms of closing kind of remarks before we move to Q&A, the collaboration is clearly really strong at COP, and I think there's been a lot of commitments across methane, across adaptation finance. There's a great resiliency index that was launched as well. So the finance is clearly there, but I think that translation of that into material roadmaps and ones where companies can actually invest in the right way is really critical. So I think from everything that the both of you are doing, and also that we're trying to support, and the rest of the startups in the room and online, it's really important that we try to have that very open process to translate that knowledge. I think that's the one key learning from this COP from my perspective has been that often scientists, for example, might talk a completely different language to bankers or CEOs of a company that's, say, in a sector that's not one that would naturally look straight away at hydrogen or at ESG data, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, and all of those voices need to be in the room. So if we were to close up in terms of your hope for where you see the roadmap ahead over the next year or so, just a quick minute on closing remarks from each of you. If we were sat here at COP 27 in Egypt, what would you like to see have changed in that time from both of your organizations?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think really it's all sections of society needs to take massive action, and everybody has a part to play. So, and I think if we work together and cut through bureaucracy, and minimize the discussions, and actually the people that wield the power make decisions, even if they're not always the right decisions. The worst thing I've sort of experienced is it's no decision is way worse than a bad decision. So decisiveness and action from everybody, because we've only got one Earth. So
yes, I would agree. I would also say that what's necessary is some really, and that's from a governmental point of view as opposed to being from the corporates or from the startups, but we need strict and very well defined standards on how this is going to be done. So it's the mechanisms and the instruments that are going to push us forward towards achieving net zero and towards adaptation. These need to be crystal clear and not changed continuously over time. So there has to be some very strict standards there. And then a lot more speed dating like today. Yes. And that would be my last word.
Hervé and John, I guess the three of you could say something. I think we're going to move actually afterwards to
Q&A.
other startups. In the
Okay. So I love Andrew's recommendation that no decision is worse than bad decisions. And I will try to tie you to, so you call for standardization and harmonized data. So I would say, let's not have the perfection be the enemy of good. We have no time to get perfect standardized data. We have probably we have 28 years to solve this. We have 8 years to be on track, because if we're not on track by 2030, it's over. And we have basically 3 years to make the right strong decisions with informed data to get on course. So in 3 years, we can't get perfect data and even less acceptance of that data. So we can't have the perfection be the enemy of good. We just need some frameworks. It will be what it is, but it will allow us to have some decisions based on some data, even if far from perfect.
Cool. I think I'll echo what Tessa Clark said again and say where we currently are at is simply not cutting it. And I think I'll talk particularly about, I guess, what TechNation's sort of core purpose is really about accelerating the growth of scaling tech companies. And I think when we look at various aspects of a scaling tech company's growth and the potential barriers, but also the potential tailwinds to that growth, I think a lot needs to happen. I'm going to focus on VC investment and think about really sort of from a market perspective what needs to change. And we're simply not seeing enough VC investment and private equity investment being made into scaling net zero companies. And for me, as we said in the report, we need to see that at least 10x over the next 2 years in order for a tangible difference to be made and for things to actually move at the pace that we need to see them. And that's likely to need to happen for a 10x over the next 2 years on a recurring basis to be able to hit those targets. Of course, we know that scaling tech companies are not going to be the sole drivers of this change, but we know that true innovation is going to come from many of these companies. And so supporting those companies to achieve that change, listening to what they need and making sure the support is there is really the emphasis that I put on the situation.
Great, thank you so much. And I know that from my perspective as working on sustainability engagement at the bank, we're going to do everything we can to try and give profile to the solutions providers like you guys that really are at the forefront of that, because we have clients that are looking for those solutions, and playing that intermediary role as a bank is really vital for us to engage on that. I think we're going to hand over to the rest of some of the founders in the room now, Sammy, aren't we? And also the recording will be available on YouTube on the Arctic Basecamp account, so we'll share that around after as well. But yeah, we'll hand over to Sammy to bring up some of the rest of the founders so you can all hear from them.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really brilliant panel. Yeah, very conscious of time, as I think we've run slightly over. But yeah, now we do have our founder pitches. So for the rest of the founders on our Net Zero program, we have 3-minute pitches. If you can keep the time, that would be hugely appreciated. But first up is Hanson Cheng, co-founder and CEO of the Tyre Collective.
Are you change the slides? Cool. So very excited to be here today. I'm Hanson. I'm one of the 3 co-founders of the Tyre Collective, where we're building innovative solutions to save our air from tire wear. So we all know tires wear down, but have never really considered where it all goes. Next. And today there's actually over 1 million tons of tire wear particles produced annually across Europe. And that's 1 million tons, making it the 2nd largest microplastic pollutant in our oceans, which is toxic to marine life, and also a major contributor to air pollution. And when we talk about zero emissions, it's just focused on the exhaust. And as we transition to electric vehicles, exhaust emissions will drastically reduce, but tire wear is actually set to increase from the added battery weight and torque. And so at the Tyre Collective, we're building a retrofittable device to capture tire wear at source, so right at the wheel, to accelerate the shift towards true zero-emission mobility. And on our patent-pending technology uses electrostatics and airflow to attract the tire particles. And on our in-lab test rig, we capture about 60% of all airborne particulates, which means we could capture about 38,000 tons of carbon-based PM pollution every year just in the UK. And captured particles can be upcycled into new tire treads, creating a closed-loop system. So today there are over 1.4 billion vehicles on the road globally, and we're targeting logistic fleets as our beachhead market with the aim to scale our device across all commercial vehicles in the EU. And we're working with leading tire and vehicle manufacturers to develop this device, and also conducting research with academic and government organizations to fill knowledge gaps on tire wear. So we recently reached a major milestone of testing our first device on a vehicle and successfully captured the world's first sample of tire wear, but this is really just the beginning. Our vision, our vision is to see our device on every vehicle, and by fitting our device to just 10,000 vehicles, we can capture about 20,000 kilos of tire wear annually. So we started this, the Tyre Collective, because we're all passionate about the environment, and we believe that as impact-driven designers, researchers, and engineers, We believe that we can solve complex problems through interdisciplinary research and collaboration. And so in our strive to kind of create net zero mobility, we must consider pollution sources beyond exhaust emissions, and also start by investing in our planet through innovative green tech, clean tech solutions. And together, let's save our air from tire wear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanson. And next up, we have Simon Hombersley, so the CEO of Xampla.
Thank you very much indeed. So right outside this building right now, there is a chunk of ice that is melting. And if you drill through a core of ice anywhere in the Arctic at the moment, you hit a layer at one point, which is microplastic pollution. Over the past 70 years, we've had plastic on this planet. It's actually only one lifetime that we've had it, and we've had an absolutely monumental impact. So it's a pollution issue, but it's also a climate issue. Within the next sort of 20 to 30 years, the increase in plastic consumption will not be stopping. We're going to be using more plastic, and in fact, as we decrease oil use towards transport, the percentage that plastic represents of the oil industry's business is actually going to increase. So this is not a situation that's going away, it's increasing. Now what Xampla has is a solution, and the solution to plastic pollution is a plastic that doesn't pollute. And that sounds very simple, but it's actually quite tricky to do. So what we take is natural polymers, things that are found in nature. We don't modify them chemically in any way, and we turn them into useful plastics, like the dishwasher tab wraps that you use every day, that are actually a microplastic contributor. We're the UK's first spin out to become a certified B Corp. We're chaired by the former Chief Sustainability Officer of Unilever, which is a pretty big statement about our ambition. And we are, like everybody in this clean tech space, we've got a great deal of momentum behind us right now. The one message I say about this scale-up stage is when we are disrupting a sector, we're not just disrupting a like-for-like business model. We're not just changing the color of the product we're introducing. When you think about the plastics industry, it's a 20th century construct, an inherently globalized industry where the externalities aren't captured in any way at all. What we're doing in plastic is turning that into a regionalized, localized. I want to grow plants locally, process them into plastic locally, and compost them back at the end of life into the same soils they came from. That is utterly disruptive to a fossil fuel industry and absolutely challenging for the banks to find a way to lend to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. I recently saw your dishwasher tablet wrapping as well. It's brilliant. Thank you. So next time we have Antony, the CEO of BX.
Thank you. Okay. Can we eat our way out of climate change? So, as Simon just mentioned there, plastic obviously is a bigger pollutant, but the elephant in the room really is the food in the bag. It is 1,000 times more impactful on climate change. And that is coming from how our food is grown. On the left-hand side, this is basically what we're doing today. It's a mixed carbon, we lose water, and our soil is basically dying. But our soil can capture carbon by implementing regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture on a net basis sequesters carbon and puts water back in the ground. Now, regenerative agriculture has the potential, if you convert all our agricultural land, to sequester more carbon than we emit today. That's the potential that we have basically underneath our feet. The problem is there is no incentive to do this, and that's why we have this going on. On the other side, the consumer wants this. In the UK alone, 120 billion is spent on the green pound. 60% of consumers are choosing products which are environmentally and socially responsible. 50% of consumers in the last year have been choosing more seasonal and local. But one of the biggest issues is the lack of information. So this is mass market already. Consumers want this. So how can we bring these two together? This is what we're trying to solve at BX. What we want to do is connect those consumers who want this, give them that information, that data, from growers who are already doing these practices, and incentivize that behavior further. So we give consumers that traceability, that provenance of exactly where the food has come from, how it was made, and what the impact is happening. If we can do that, if we can connect those two things up, we can channel that finance, we can channel those decisions, and start rewarding those growers. we're using data science, collecting all this data on farm, modeling to understand not only the emissions, but also, more importantly, the soil carbon sequestration. It's there that we can basically have some serious negative emissions on the food that we eat. The food that we eat can be natively carbon negative. And the most important thing here is actually making sure it's our supply chain currently right now, which does not reward this practice. It incentivizes cheap food at the expense of our natural capital and our world. But by utilizing blockchain smart contracts, for example, we can ensure that the payment explicitly goes to the growers for doing those positive practices. So, and then on the other side, the person who is backing that, investing in that, explicitly gets that data backed impact. And then that can be augmented to the consumer. So we believe we're hopefully completely reworking the business model in the food system, where consumers effectively will be rewarding those positive practices. Growers then have the incentive to do it. We start to repair our planet with our food, and that generates obviously environmental, social benefits for us all. And that should be a very virtuous circle versus a vicious one right now. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And Albert, Head of Sustainability at Sourceful.
Thanks, Sammy. So I head up sustainability at a company called Sourceful. What is Sourceful? We're building an end-to-end platform for sustainable sourcing, so helping businesses find, design, and source sustainable packaging. We started by challenging this notion that consumers are the sole blame for the world's environmental problems, right? The reality is consumers only have what's available to them, and we shouldn't be continually asking consumers to have to renege on convenience and cost in order to be impactful, and we have this trade-off. And so that's really why we set up Sourceful to change the way businesses buy in order to deliver on that. I think I'm not going to get into it now, but we all know that supply chains are a huge contributor to global emissions. The top 3 out of the 4 supply emitters are the consumer supply chains: fashion, food and beverage, and FMCG. And to be honest, we thought we were doing something quite unsexy, quite under the radar by looking at supply chain, and little did we know that the last 12 months, supply chain is one of the sort of most talked about issues for a whole variety of reasons. But what are we actually building? What are we actually doing? I think it helps to start with the problem. Sourcing has always been difficult for businesses, and what we saw in D2C with e-commerce, a very seamless sourcing, purchasing experience, we don't have in B2B. It's incredibly offline, it's incredibly challenging, and actually businesses have a lot of pain points in how they purchase and how they source products. And I think the best way to illustrate that is with an example of a business we worked with. Fenton is one of our clients. They're an ethical jewelry company. They needed to redesign their packaging. So their boxes, their containers, their ring boxes, their marketing materials. And they had experienced a number of challenges: inconsistent lead times, no price data, no reliable science-based information on which to make a decision on their product. What did we do for them? Well, we connected them with suppliers. We found sustainable products for their packaging. We redesigned it. We gave it the branding that a luxury brand deserves. We found a way to cut the time that it took for them to go around lots of suppliers, and indeed the challenge of managing your operations there with multiple suppliers, with challenging replenishment and logistics arrangements, all under one platform. The important bit here really is what was the impact of that? Well, it was halving the cost of their packaging, whilst also leveling up the branding of their product, and also changing the game with the impact of that product, right? And we're getting quite good at delivering on that trinity of price, of convenience, function, and impact. So what are we building? This is a platform that we launch early next year. It's curated sourcing. It's data-driven customization. We have LCA embedded within that. You can't improve what you don't measure. There's 22 billion variants of a mailer box. So we had to build an engine that models all of those. So you have not just price information on which to make those decisions, but you also have impact data on which to make those decisions about any product that you source. And indeed, we bring it all under one platform, multiple suppliers, tech solutions to manage your ongoing replenishment, and the data to make these better decisions. I think that's a bit of a theme that's coming out. What's been the traction to date? We've shipped over 1 million items from over 40 suppliers. To do that, we've scaled the team to about 55, and there's a lot of additional markets, a lot of additional segments that we can tackle. So really, I think the point here is we need technological innovations. We also need the capabilities, the platforms, the businesses in order to scale the deployment of those solutions. And really, that's what we're seeking to do. Find the best products, find the best suppliers, and connect those to the businesses that purchase them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert. And next up, we have Sabrina. I believe Sabrina can't make it today, but I believe there is a video.
This game-changing technology from Act Blade is the first of its kind in the world. A new type of blade that offers significant cost and sustainability benefits. Yachting design specialist Smar Azur adapted their sail modelling technology to engineer a next-generation offshore wind turbine blade.
Act blades are very different from conventional blades, where conventional blades are made of solid glass fibre or composite material. Our blades have a textile cover over a composite structure.
Not only our blade is lighter than conventional blade, this means that we can build a longer blade and therefore produce more energy and directly reduce the cost of energy.
They don't require finishing and painting, making them more sustainable and easier to recycle. As part of an Innovate UK funded project, ORE Catapult is working alongside their partners to support Act Blade to bring the blade to market. After 6 years of work, in July 2021, the blades were installed on a turbine at the Energy Technology Centre's wind farm test site in Scotland. The blades will undergo testing and performance data gathering to help inform the next evolution of the Act Blade.
These blades will let us prove that the technology works, demonstrate it in the field, and show that textile blades really are the future.
That's lovely that you still clap when she's not here. Brilliant. That is a wrap for today. So I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists, our speakers, to BNP Paribas, Sarisher, especially, and Arctic Basecamp for hosting us. If you'd like to get in touch with the Net Zero program, please do email netzero@technation.io. And thank you for tuning in as well, if you have tuned in. And after this, for everyone in the room, we are moving over to the TP Hut for networking, so I hope you can join us there. So thank you very much.